Welcome to Story Planet, where we bring you soothing tales to help you unwind. Tonight's story is The Amber Lantern. So settle in, get cozy, and let yourself drift into a world of mystery and light. Feel the glow of the lantern, the whispers of the sea, and the warmth of a story crafted to bring you peace. Now let's begin. Lillian Hartley stood at the edge of the cliff, her gaze fixed on the sea that churned below. The waves were restless, hurling themselves against the jagged rocks as though they were trying to claw their way up the cliffside. The salty air clung to her skin, and the faint cry of gulls echoed above her. Somewhere deep within her, a mixture of apprehension and hope stirred, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Behind her, the quaint village of Westhaven spread out like a painting, its cobblestone streets winding between thatched cottages and weathered shop fronts. It was as though time had stopped in this corner of the world, preserving a simpler way of life. The villagers had watched her arrival with curiosity. She was, after all, an outsider, a woman from the city whose presence among them was both unexpected and intriguing. The letter that brought her here had been a curious thing. Arriving on a dreary morning in London, it was marked with a wax seal she didn't recognize. Inside, the solicitor's words had been formal but puzzling. "Dear Miss Hartley, I am writing to inform you of an inheritance left to you by your late great-aunt, Clara Hartley. You are now the sole proprietor of the Amber Lantern, an inn situated in the coastal village of Westhaven. Enclosed are the details of the property and the accompanying legal documents. I trust you will find this matter of interest and hope to hear from you at your earliest convenience." An inheritance? From a relative she scarcely remembered? It seemed almost too strange to be true. But the timing had been uncanny. Just weeks before, Lillian had bid farewell to her husband, whose long illness had left her both emotionally and financially drained. London, once her sanctuary, now felt suffocating. This offer, a chance to begin again, had felt like a lifeline. And so she had packed her belongings, boarded a train, and arrived in Westhaven on a misty afternoon with nothing but a worn suitcase and a heart searching for solace. The Amber Lantern stood before her now, a hulking structure perched precariously near the edge of the cliff. Its timbered frame, cloaked in ivy and weathered by decades of salt air, seemed almost alive, as though it had been waiting for her arrival. The solicitor, a man named Mr. Cartwright, had been waiting as well. He was tall and thin, with a kind but formal demeanor. He handed her a large iron key. "It is yours now, Miss Hartley," he said simply. "The Amber Lantern has stood as a beacon for this village for centuries. I trust you'll find it as welcoming as your great-aunt Clara intended." As she stepped inside for the first time, Lillian's breath caught. The air inside was cool and carried the unmistakable scent of time, a mixture of aged wood, damp stone, and something faintly floral. Dust covered the surfaces and cobwebs draped the corners, but there was an undeniable charm to the place. A massive stone hearth dominated the main room, flanked by sturdy wooden chairs and tables. The oak floorboards creaked under her steps, and the windows, though grimy, let in the golden glow of the setting sun. That night, sleep eluded her. The sounds of the sea seemed louder in the darkness, and the creaks and groans of the old inn kept her on edge. Unable to stay in bed, she lit a candle and wandered through the inn's many rooms, her bare feet padding softly against the cool floor. It was during this restless exploration that she discovered the attic. The narrow staircase leading up was hidden behind a door she almost missed. It groaned in protest as she ascended, the air growing colder with each step. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten relics. Trunks piled high, their brass locks tarnished with age, sat beside stacks of yellowing newspapers. Curtains long abandoned hung limply from iron rods, their fabric stiff with dust. Among the clutter, one item caught her eye. A leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the initials HR. It rested atop a small wooden chest as though it had been placed there deliberately. With trembling hands, Lillian picked it up and opened it. The handwriting inside was elegant, each word carefully penned in black ink. April 3rd, 1721. The first entry began. Tonight, the lantern burns bright, a beacon for the weary and the lost. The storm outside howls with a fury I have never known, but within these walls there is warmth, laughter, and hope. Lillian's heart quickened as she read on. The writer described scenes of the inn in its prime. Travelers gathered around the hearth, sharing stories of their journeys, villagers seeking refuge from the storm, and the lantern outside, its golden glow cutting through the fog like a promise of safety. For hours, she sat there, engrossed in the words of someone who had lived centuries before. The entries were rich with detail, painting vivid pictures of life in Westhaven during the early 18th century. The author's voice was both poetic and introspective, capturing moments of joy, sorrow, and quiet reflection. As the candle burned low, Lillian closed the journal and placed it carefully back on the chest. She felt a strange connection to its writer, as though their words had reached across time to find her in this quiet attic. And for the first time in months, she felt something other than grief. A spark of curiosity, a flicker of purpose. "Who were you?" she whispered to the darkness, "and why did you leave this behind?" The amber lantern held secrets, she was sure of it, and Lillian was determined to uncover them, one page at a time. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the cracked windows of the amber lantern, casting long golden beams that danced across the dust-laden surfaces. Lillian stood in the center of the main room, holding a cloth in one hand and a bucket of soapy water in the other. Cleaning the inn felt like a ritual of renewal, as though she were peeling back layers of time to reveal something vibrant and alive beneath the grime. She began with the hearth, scrubbing the stones until they gleamed and sweeping away the ash of long-forgotten fires. Each stroke of her hand seemed to echo with whispers of the past. Her thoughts kept drifting to the journal, resting safely on her bedside table. The words of HR lingered in her mind, teasing her with fragments of stories she was desperate to piece together. Midway through her work, there was a knock at the door. Lillian set down the bucket and hurried to open it. Standing on the threshold was an elderly man with a weathered face and a kind smile. He carried a basket of fresh bread and a jar of honey, their aromas filling the air between them. "Good morning, Miss Hartley," he said in a deep, warm voice. "I'm Thomas Beale. My family's lived in Westhaven for generations. We're glad to see someone finally taking care of the old inn." Lillian invited him in, grateful for the company. Over cups of tea brewed in the ancient kitchen, Thomas shared stories of the inn's glory days. "The amber lantern was the heart of the village," he said, his eyes twinkling with nostalgia. "People came from miles around to gather here. There's a magic to this place, you know, a kind of light that draws people in." Lillian nodded, her thoughts returning to the journal. "I found something in the attic," she said hesitantly. "A journal, written by someone named HR4. Do you know who that might have been?" Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. "Ah, the lantern's keeper," he murmured. "I've heard tales about him. No one knew his real name, but they said he had a way of bringing light to the darkest corners of people's lives. He was a storyteller, a healer of sorts. Maybe that journal will tell you more." As Thomas departed, leaving behind his gifts of bread and honey, Lillian felt a growing determination to uncover the truth. She spent the rest of the day cleaning, her mind racing with possibilities. By the time evening fell, the inn was beginning to shine again, its warmth slowly returning. That night, she returned to the journal, her fingers tracing the embossed initials on the cover. "HR," she whispered, opening it once more. The words within were like a map, guiding her deeper into the inn's history and the life of the enigmatic lantern's keeper. The following entries were filled with vivid descriptions of the village as it once was. HR wrote of nights when storms raged and the inn's lantern shone as a beacon for travelers lost in the fog. There were accounts of villagers gathered around the hearth, their laughter and stories filling the room. Each entry carried a sense of intimacy, as though HR was speaking directly to the reader. One entry caught Lillian's attention. It described a night when a young sailor arrived at the inn, his clothes soaked and his expression weary. HR had welcomed him, offering dry clothes and a hot meal by the fire. Over the course of the evening, the sailor shared tales of his voyages, speaking of distant lands and the dangers of the sea. He carried a burden heavier than his pack, HR had written. But as the hours passed and the warmth of the inn wrapped around him, I saw his shoulders relax, his laughter return. By the time he left, the light in his eyes had been rekindled. It is moments like these that remind me why I keep the lantern burning. The imagery was so vivid that Lillian could almost hear the crackling of the fire, the soft murmur of voices, and the distant howl of the wind outside. She closed the journal, her heart full of questions. Who was HR? What drove them to dedicate their life to this place? And why did it feel as though their words were meant for her? The next morning, Lillian awoke to find a small crowd gathered outside the inn. Word had spread that she was restoring the amber lantern, and villagers had come to offer their help. Among them was Mary Finch, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, and Jacob, a young carpenter eager to lend his skills. "This place has been empty for too long," Mary said as she wiped her hands on her apron. "It's about time someone brought it back to life. What can we do to help?" With their assistance, the restoration progressed more quickly. Jacob repaired the creaking stairs, while Mary scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed. Others brought supplies, fresh paint, sturdy wood for repairs, and even flowers to brighten the windowsills. As the days passed, the inn began to transform, its former beauty emerging bit by bit. In the evenings, Lillian returned to the journal, piecing together the story of HR and the inn's storied past. The villagers, too, shared their own memories of the amber lantern. One elderly man recalled dancing in the main room as a boy, while a woman spoke of meeting her late husband there during a winter festival. The more she learned, the more Lillian felt connected to the inn and its history. It was as though the spirit of the place had been waiting for her, guiding her toward something she couldn't yet fully understand. But one thing was certain. The amber lantern was more than just an inn. It was a sanctuary, a beacon, and a keeper of stories, both past and present. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Lillian stood outside the inn, gazing at the lantern that now shone brightly once more. Its golden light cut through the darkness, a promise of warmth and refuge to all who saw it. And in that moment, she felt a quiet certainty. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Over the following weeks, the transformation of the amber lantern became a village-wide endeavor. The morning sun would rise to the sound of hammers and saws, the laughter of children carrying supplies, and the hum of voices planning the day's work. Lillian, who had initially thought she would be undertaking this journey alone, now found herself surrounded by an unexpected family of helpers. The main room became the heart of the restoration efforts. Tables and chairs were sanded down and polished to reveal the rich oak beneath years of grime. Mary Finch, with her knack for organization, turned the kitchen into a bustling hub of activity. She led a team of women who scrubbed pots, sharpened knives, and cleaned every inch until the space gleamed. "This kitchen used to feed half the village during festivals," Mary remarked one afternoon. Her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded dough. "I can't wait to see it alive again." Jacob, the carpenter, focused on the structural repairs. He reinforced the beams that groaned under the weight of age and repaired the warped floorboards. With every creak silenced, the inn seemed to breathe easier, its foundation growing stronger. "The lantern's got good bones," he told Lillian, running a hand over the newly restored banister of the staircase. "Just needed a little care." As the physical work progressed, Lillian found herself drawn deeper into the journal. Each night, she would sit by the hearth with a cup of tea, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover before flipping to the next entry. HR's words painted vivid pictures of life in the inn's heyday. There were tales of joyous celebrations, quiet evenings by the fire, and moments of deep connection shared between strangers. One entry described a winter solstice gathering, where villagers and travelers alike came together to celebrate. The lantern burned brighter than ever, HR wrote, its light casting a golden glow on the snow-covered landscape outside. Inside, the inn was alive with music, laughter, and the scent of mulled cider. It is on nights like these, HR had penned, that I am reminded of the beauty of human connection. The walls of this inn hold more than stone and wood. They hold memories, laughter, and the resilience of those who pass through its doors. Inspired by these words, Lillian decided to recreate the spirit of that solstice gathering. She shared the idea with the villagers, who embraced it eagerly. Plans were made for a grand reopening, a celebration to mark the return of the Amber Lantern as the heart of Westhaven. The day of the event dawned clear and crisp. The inn's exterior had been scrubbed clean, the ivy trimmed back to frame the windows. Inside, the main room was adorned with garlands of holly and candles that cast a warm glow over the polished surfaces. The lantern outside burned brightly, its light a beacon to all who approached. Villagers arrived dressed in their finest, carrying dishes of food and bottles of wine. The air was filled with the sounds of music and laughter, a joyful symphony that echoed through the night. Lillian moved through the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude as she watched the inn come alive again. Near the hearth, Thomas Beale stood with a group of elders, sharing stories of the inn's past. Mary Finch and her team served steaming bowls of stew from the kitchen, while Jacob showed off the repaired staircase to an admiring group of children. As the evening progressed, Lillian found herself drawn to the journal once more. She had placed it on a small table near the lantern, a symbolic gesture that seemed fitting for the occasion. Picking it up, she turned to a page she hadn't yet read. The light of the lantern is not just a guide for those lost in the fog, HR had written. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is warmth to be found. It is the promise of home, no matter how far one has wandered. The words resonated deeply, and Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. She closed the journal and placed it back on the table, her resolve strengthening. This was more than a reopening, it was a revival of the inn's spirit, a continuation of the legacy HR had left behind. As midnight approached, the villagers gathered outside to watch the lantern's light shine against the star-filled sky. Lillian stood among them, her heart full as she looked at the faces around her. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging, a connection to something greater than herself. When the last guest had departed and the inn had grown quiet, Lillian stood alone in the main room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the lantern outside cast a gentle glow through the windows. She placed a hand on the journal, whispering a silent promise to its author. "I will keep the light burning," she said, and as she turned to head upstairs, she knew that the Amber Lantern had truly become her home. As Westhaven settled back into its familiar rhythm after the grand reopening, the restored Amber Lantern continued to radiate life and warmth. Lillian found herself increasingly curious about the man behind the initials HR, the enigmatic lantern's keeper, whose journal had woven a spell over her heart. Each night, she delved deeper into the pages, unearthing fragments of his story. The entries began to take on a more personal tone, offering glimpses into HR's thoughts and struggles. He wrote of sleepless nights spent tending to travelers who arrived at the inn during storms, of mending broken furniture and soothing frayed tempers. Yet amidst the challenges, his words carried a quiet strength, a resolve to keep the light burning for all who needed it. "This lantern is more than an object," HR had penned in one entry. "It is a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, light can find its way through." One crisp autumn afternoon, Lillian decided to take a walk to clear her mind and perhaps glean more about HR from the villagers. She made her way to Thomas Beale's home, a cozy cottage nestled near the cliffs. Thomas greeted her warmly and invited her inside, where the aroma of freshly brewed tea filled the air. "I've been reading the journal again," Lillian began as she sipped her tea. "HR seems to have been more than just an innkeeper. Do you know anything else about him?" Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. The stories I've heard were passed down through generations, he said. HR was said to be a man of great compassion, someone who believed in the power of community. He had a way of making everyone feel seen and valued, no matter their station in life. Some even say he was a healer, though whether of the body or the spirit, no one can quite agree. Lillian nodded, her curiosity piqued. And the lantern? She asked. Why was it so important to him? Thomas smiled. It wasn't just a lantern, Lillian. It was his way of saying, you are not alone. In a time when people traveled great distances with little more than the stars to guide them, that light was a lifeline. It gave them hope. As she walked back to the inn, Thomas's words lingered in her mind. The lantern wasn't merely an object. It was a promise, and it was a promise she now felt compelled to uphold. That evening, as a storm rolled in from the sea, Lillian settled by the hearth with the journal. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the inn felt safe and secure. She flipped to a page marked by a faint smudge, as though HR had paused mid-thought before continuing. Tonight the storm rages, the entry began. The wind tears at the shutters and the sea roars its fury. Yet within these walls there is peace. A young woman arrived just before the downpour began, her face pale with fear. She carried a child wrapped in a tattered blanket, both of them soaked to the bone. I offered them warmth, food, and a place to rest. As the fire crackled and the child's cries quieted, I saw her fear give way to gratitude. HR's words painted a vivid picture, and Lillian felt as though she were there, watching the scene unfold. The entry continued. I am reminded tonight that the lantern's light is not only for those outside, but for those within. It is a beacon of hope, yes, but also a reminder that kindness and compassion are the truest forms of light. Perhaps that is why I keep it burning, to remind myself of what truly matters. Lillian closed the journal, her mind spinning with thoughts. She had come to Westhaven seeking solace, but she was beginning to realize that her journey was about more than her own healing. The amber lantern had a legacy, one that she was now a part of. The storm continued through the night, but Lillian felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. As she drifted off to sleep, the sound of the rain mingling with the crackle of the fire, she resolved to learn everything she could about HR and to honor his legacy in her own way. In the days that followed, Lillian began to notice subtle changes in herself. She smiled more easily, laughed more freely, and found joy in the smallest tasks. The villagers, too, seemed to respond to the inn's renewed spirit. People lingered longer during their visits, sharing stories and laughter over cups of tea. Children played outside the inn, their laughter echoing against the cliffs. One afternoon, Mary Finch arrived with a bundle of old letters tied with a ribbon. I found these in my attic, she said, placing them on the table. They're from my great-grandmother. She mentioned the amber lantern quite a bit. I thought you might find them interesting. Lillian's heart raced as she untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were filled with vivid descriptions of life in Westhaven, and many referenced a kind innkeeper who always seemed to know just what to say to ease a troubled heart. One letter stood out. The lantern's light was like a star fallen to earth, it read. It guided me home when I thought I had lost my way, not just on the road but in my heart. The innkeeper, with his warm smile and wise words, reminded me that no matter how dark the night, the dawn will always come. Tears filled Lillian's eyes as she read the words. She realized that HR's legacy wasn't just in the journal or the inn itself, but in the countless lives he had touched, and now she had the opportunity to continue that legacy. Standing by the window, Lillian watched as the sun dipped below the horizon, its golden light fading into the deep blue of twilight. The lantern outside flickered to life, its warm glow cutting through the gathering darkness. It was a small light, but it was enough. You are not alone, she whispered, repeating Thomas's words as though speaking to the night itself. And in her heart, she knew she never would be. Lillian's days at the Amber Lantern began to settle into a comforting routine, but her nights were consumed by the stories she uncovered in HR's journal and the letters Mary had shared. Each new discovery felt like peeling back a layer of history, revealing not only the life of HR, but also the heart of the village itself. One letter in particular caught her attention. Written in a delicate, looping script, it described a winter night when the inn had provided shelter for a group of musicians traveling between towns. The writer, a violinist named Clara, described the warmth of the hearth, the kindness of the innkeeper, and the impromptu concert that filled the night with music and laughter. The innkeeper insisted we stay, Clara had written. He said the storm was no match for the sanctuary of the Amber Lantern. We played until the early hours, our music blending with the crackle of the fire and the whispers of the storm. I will never forget the way the light from the lantern danced on the walls, nor the peace that settled in my heart that night. Lillian closed the letter, imagining the scene. The golden glow of the lantern casting soft shadows, the haunting notes of a violin weaving through the room. The image stayed with her as she went about her day, a quiet reminder of the joy that had lived within these walls. The following morning, Lillian decided to explore the storage cellar, a space she had largely ignored since her arrival. Armed with a lantern and a determined spirit, she descended the narrow stairs, the air growing cooler with each step. The cellar was cluttered with crates and barrels, many marked with faded labels that hinted at the inn's long history. In one corner, she found a dusty trunk bound with rusted hinges. With effort, she pried it open to reveal a collection of objects that seemed to span decades. There were old ledgers, a bundle of faded photographs, and a neatly folded cloak that smelled faintly of lavender. Among these treasures was a small, intricately carved box. Inside, Lillian discovered a collection of handwritten notes, each bearing the signature HR. She carried the box upstairs and spent the afternoon poring over its contents. The notes were brief but poignant, offering glimpses into HR's thoughts and the lives he touched. One note, addressed to a woman named Eleanor, read, "Do not let the weight of the world dim your light. You are stronger than you know, and the dawn will always follow the night." Another note, unsigned but likely written by a guest, described HR as a man of quiet strength and a soul that seemed to carry the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes. These pieces of HR's life painted a picture of a man deeply connected to his community, someone who saw the inn not just as a business, but as a sanctuary. Lillian felt a growing admiration for him, as well as a sense of responsibility to carry forward the spirit of the Amber Lantern. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lillian decided to host a small gathering at the inn. She invited Thomas, Mary, and a handful of other villagers who had become regular visitors. They arrived bearing dishes of food and bottles of wine, their laughter filling the air as they settled into the main room. The evening unfolded with an ease that felt almost magical. Stories were shared, songs were sung, and for a moment it felt as though time had turned back. Lillian watched the villagers interact, their faces lit by the warm glow of the lantern, and felt a deep sense of contentment. This was what HR had cherished, the simple, profound beauty of human connection. Toward the end of the night, Thomas raised a glass. "To the Amber Lantern," he said, his voice steady and heartfelt, "and to Lillian for bringing it back to life. May its light continue to guide us, just as it always has." The room erupted in cheers, and Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. She raised her own glass, her heart full of gratitude. "To all of you," she said, "for helping me see that the light of this place doesn't come from its lantern alone. It comes from the people who gather here, who share their stories and their hearts. Thank you." As the guests departed and the inn grew quiet once more, Lillian stood by the window, watching the lantern's light flicker in the darkness. She felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known in years, as though she had finally found her place in the world. Turning back to the journal, she opened to a blank page and picked up a pen. For the first time, she added her own words to its storied pages. "Tonight, the light of the Amber Lantern burned bright, not just for those who entered its doors, but for me as well. This place is more than an inn. It is a home, a refuge and a testament to the power of connection. I will do my best to honor its legacy, just as HR did before me. Satisfied, Lillian closed the journal and set it gently on the table. She extinguished the lantern by the hearth, leaving the one outside to guide any late travelers who might need its light. And as she climbed the stairs to her room, she felt a sense of peace that carried her into dreams of golden light and echoes of laughter. The dawn brought a sky painted in hues of soft pink and gold, and the village of Westhaven stirred to life with a comforting hum of daily activity. For Lillian, however, the morning carried a sense of unease she couldn't quite place. She had begun to notice subtle inconsistencies in the journal entries and the stories she had heard from the villagers. It was as though pieces of HR's story had been deliberately hidden or perhaps lost to time. Determined to uncover the truth, she turned her attention back to the items she had retrieved from the storage cellar. Among the ledgers and faded photographs, one object stood out: an old map of the village and its surrounding areas. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded in places, but it showed landmarks that seemed oddly unfamiliar. One marking in particular caught her eye: a small symbol resembling a lantern etched near the cliffs to the west of the inn. Lillian traced the symbol with her fingertip, a sense of anticipation rising within her. Could this be connected to HR? The thought consumed her as she prepared for the day, her mind racing with possibilities. After breakfast, she packed a small bag with essentials and set out toward the cliffs, the map tucked securely in her pocket. The path to the cliffs was overgrown and rarely used, but Lillian pushed through the brambles and tall grass, her resolve unwavering. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below grew louder as she neared the edge, the salty air sharp in her lungs. She paused to consult the map, her heart pounding with the thrill of discovery. The marked location was a small hollow, partially obscured by a cluster of weathered boulders. As Lillian approached, she noticed something she hadn't expected: the faint outline of a wooden door set into the rock face. Its surface was worn and splintered, but the brass handle gleamed as though it had been recently polished. Taking a deep breath, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Lillian's lantern cast a warm, flickering light as she began her descent, the air growing cooler with each step. The walls were lined with stone, damp to the touch, and the faint scent of the sea lingered in the air. At the bottom of the staircase, Lillian found herself in a small chamber. The room was sparsely furnished, with a wooden table and chair, a few shelves lined with books, and a single lantern hanging from a hook on the wall. In the center of the table lay a bundle of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The sight sent a shiver through her, and she hesitated before reaching out to touch them. The first letter she opened was addressed to HR. The handwriting was elegant and precise, and the words within were filled with gratitude and affection. The writer spoke of a debt they could never repay, of a kindness that had saved their life. Other letters told similar stories, each one painting a picture of HR as a figure of quiet heroism, someone who had offered help and hope when it was needed most. But it was the final letter that stopped Lillian in her tracks. It was unsigned, the ink smudged as though written in haste. The words were fragmented, cryptic, yet they carried a sense of urgency. The light must not go out. There are forces that would see it extinguished, but you must protect it at all costs. The lantern is more than a guide. It is a safeguard, a beacon against the darkness. Trust no one. Lillian's hands trembled as she read and reread the letter. What darkness did the writer mean? And why had they entrusted this warning to HR? The question swirled in her mind as she carefully tucked the letters into her bag, her resolve to uncover the truth stronger than ever. Back at the inn, Lillian spread the letters and the map across the table in the main room. She pored over them late into the night, cross-referencing the landmarks on the map with the stories she had read in the journal. Patterns began to emerge, connections she hadn't noticed before. It was as though HR had left a trail of breadcrumbs, clues hidden in plain sight for someone to find. She barely noticed the passage of time until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. Exhausted but exhilarated, Lillian leaned back in her chair, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The amber lantern, she realized, was more than just a sanctuary. It was part of something much larger, a legacy that spanned generations and carried a responsibility she was only beginning to understand. As she extinguished the lantern by the hearth and prepared to rest, Lillian felt a sense of clarity. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and she was ready to face whatever lay ahead, no matter how deep the mystery ran. The following morning, Lillian awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The discoveries from the hidden chamber weighed on her mind, but they also ignited a curiosity she hadn't felt in years. The unsigned letter's cryptic warning echoed in her thoughts as she made her way to the kitchen, where the comforting aroma of tea and freshly baked bread awaited her. She spread the map across the dining table, her fingers tracing the routes and landmarks she had studied the night before. Patterns seemed to emerge, symbols and notations that aligned with entries in HR's journal and the letters she had found. It was clear that the lantern was more than a simple beacon. It was a symbol, a connection to something larger than the inn or even the village itself. After breakfast, Lillian decided to seek out Thomas Beale. If anyone in Westhaven could help her piece together the puzzle, it was him. She found him in his garden, tending to a row of roses with careful precision. When she mentioned the hidden chamber and the letters, his weathered face grew serious. "I had heard rumors about a place like that," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "My grandfather used to speak of secret rooms and passages around the village, places meant to protect those in need during troubled times. But I never thought they were real." Lillian showed him the unsigned letter, and his expression darkened. Whatever darkness this speaks of, it's clear HR believed the lantern was key to keeping it at bay. The question is, what exactly was he guarding against? That evening, Lillian returned to the journal, her mind racing with theories. She flipped through the pages, searching for any mention of threats or dangers. One entry, dated several months before HR's final words, caught her attention. "The lantern's light must remain constant. It is not merely a guide for the lost, but a safeguard for the soul. There are those who would see it extinguished, not out of malice, but out of ignorance. They do not understand its purpose, its power. I must remain vigilant." The entry sent a chill down Lillian's spine. What could have driven HR to such lengths to protect the lantern? And why did its light hold such significance? The answers seemed just out of reach, like shadows dancing at the edge of her vision. Over the next few days, Lillian delved deeper into the inn's history. She spoke with villagers, pored over records in the local library, and spent hours cross-referencing maps and journals. Each discovery added another piece to the puzzle, but the full picture remained elusive. One afternoon, while exploring a seldom-used storage room in the inn, she uncovered an old painting. It depicted the amber lantern as it might have appeared centuries ago, its windows glowing warmly against the backdrop of a stormy sky. At the center of the painting stood a figure holding the lantern high, their face obscured by the glow. Beneath the image, a simple inscription read, "To light the way." Lillian hung the painting in the main room, where it seemed to belong. The villagers who visited the inn remarked on it with a mix of curiosity and reverence, as though the image stirred something deep within their collective memory. Late one evening, as a storm brewed over the sea, Lillian sat by the hearth with the journal and the letters spread before her. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the inn felt safe and secure. She thought of the painting, the hidden chamber, and the cryptic warnings that seemed to thread through every piece of the mystery. Perhaps, she mused aloud, the lantern's light is not just for others. Perhaps it is also meant to guide me. As she extinguished the lantern for the night, a sense of determination settled over her. Whatever secrets the amber lantern held, she would uncover them. She would protect its legacy, just as HR had before her. and in the quiet stillness of the inn, as the storm raged on outside, the lantern by the door burned brightly, its golden glow a steadfast promise in the darkness. The next morning, a soft mist clung to the village, blurring the line between the sea and sky. Lillian stood at the window of her room, the journal resting in her hands. Her thoughts returned to the cryptic entries and the clues they offered. She decided it was time to gather the voices of Westhaven, to hear what the villagers knew, even if they were unaware of its importance. She began by inviting a small group of villagers to the inn for an afternoon tea. Thomas Beale was the first to arrive, followed by Mary Finch, Jacob the carpenter, and a few elders who rarely ventured far from their homes. They brought with them the warmth of familiarity, their voices filling the inn's main room with laughter and conversation. After serving tea and biscuits, Lillian carefully steered the discussion toward the history of the village and the amber lantern. "Have any of you heard stories about the lantern or its significance?" she asked, her tone light but her curiosity clear. The elders exchanged glances before one of them, a woman named Edith, spoke up. "My father used to say the lantern wasn't just for the inn," she began. "It was a symbol for the whole village. He said it guided more than just travelers. It guided hearts, kept us united." Jacob nodded, adding, "I remember my grandmother telling me about a time when the lantern's light went out during a storm. She said it felt like the whole village held its breath until it was relit." Mary's voice was quieter, almost hesitant. "I heard a tale once about the lantern being tied to the cliffs," she said. "Something about a light keeper, someone who watched over it to make sure it never went out, no matter the cost." Lillian listened intently, piecing together the fragments of their stories. Each memory seemed to hint at a deeper truth, one that lay just beyond her grasp. As the villagers departed, Lillian felt a mix of gratitude and urgency. Their stories, though incomplete, reinforced the idea that the lantern was more than a symbol. It was a lifeline, a thread connecting past and present. Determined to uncover more, she spent the evening revisiting the letters and maps, searching for a clue she might have missed. Her efforts were rewarded when she noticed a faint marking on the map she had overlooked before. Near the cliffs, not far from the hidden chamber, was a symbol identical to the one carved into the lantern itself. It was faint, almost erased by time, but it was enough to reignite her resolve. The next morning, Lillian returned to the cliffs, this time with Thomas by her side. The older man carried a sturdy lantern, its glass polished to a high shine. Together, they retraced her previous steps, their path illuminated by the soft morning light. When they reached the hidden chamber, Lillian showed Thomas the letters and the unsigned warning. His expression grew somber as he read. "There's something here we're not seeing," he said. "A piece of the puzzle that's missing." They searched the chamber thoroughly, their movements careful but determined. It was Thomas who noticed it first, a small, barely visible latch embedded in the stone wall. When he pressed it, the wall shifted slightly, revealing a narrow passageway that descended deeper into the earth. The air was cool and damp as they ventured down the passage, their lantern casting long shadows on the rough stone walls. The passage ended in a circular room, its ceiling arched like the inside of a cathedral. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it rested a glass case. Inside the case was a second lantern, smaller but identical to the one at the inn. Lillian approached the pedestal with reverence, her breath catching as she studied the lantern. Its design was intricate, its surface engraved with symbols she couldn't decipher. Beside it lay a book bound in dark leather, its edges worn with age. She opened the book carefully, the pages crackling softly. The writing inside was in HR's hand, but the words were different from those in the journal. These were instructions, detailed and precise. The lantern's twin must remain hidden. Its light is not for guidance, but for protection. Should the time come when its flame is needed, the keeper will know. Thomas looked over her shoulder, his voice hushed. "What does it mean?" Lillian shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know. But I think HR was preparing for something something he feared might come to pass. Back at the inn, Lillian and Thomas shared their discovery with Mary and Jacob. The group pored over the book and the second lantern, their collective curiosity driving them late into the night. The mystery seemed larger than any of them had imagined, but Lillian felt a growing certainty that she was on the right path. As the clock struck midnight, she stood by the window, watching the light of the amber lantern flicker against the darkness. The weight of its legacy felt heavy, but not unwelcome. She had become a part of its story, a keeper of its light. And though she didn't yet have all the answers, she knew one thing for certain. The lantern's light would endure, just as it always had, guiding those who sought its warmth and protecting against the unseen shadows of the night. The village of Westhaven awoke to a morning bathed in golden light, the mist of the previous days lifting to reveal a brilliant sky. For Lillian, however, the brightness outside was a sharp contrast to the storm of questions brewing within her. The twin lantern's existence, its cryptic instructions, and H.R.'s carefully guarded secrets all weighed heavily on her mind. After breakfast, she gathered Thomas, Mary, and Jacob in the main room of the inn. The second lantern sat on the table between them, its intricate engravings glinting in the morning sunlight. Beside it lay the leather-bound book, its pages filled with H.R.'s precise instructions. The room was quiet, the group's collective curiosity palpable. The phrase, "Its light is not for guidance but for protection," stands out to me, Lillian began, pointing to the passage in the book. What could it mean? Protection from what? Thomas leaned forward, his weathered hands resting on the table. Whatever it is, H.R. clearly thought it was important enough to hide this lantern and leave these instructions. Maybe it's symbolic, something tied to the village's history. Mary shook her head, her expression thoughtful. It feels like more than symbolism. This isn't just a relic or a keepsake. H.R. believed this lantern had a purpose, one that could only be fulfilled at the right time. Jacob, who had been studying the engravings on the lantern, finally spoke. These symbols, they're familiar. I've seen similar patterns carved into the cliffs near the old lighthouse. Could there be a connection? The group exchanged glances, their curiosity now tinged with urgency. It was decided they would visit the cliffs that afternoon to investigate. The path to the lighthouse was rugged but scenic, winding through fields of wildflowers and past the edge of the forest. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of the sea. Lillian carried the second lantern carefully, its weight a reminder of the responsibility she now bore. When they reached the lighthouse, its towering silhouette stood stark against the azure sky. The structure was weathered, its stones pitted and worn by centuries of salt and wind. Jacob led the way, guiding the group to a section of the cliffs where the carvings he had mentioned were etched into the rock. Lillian's breath caught as she studied the patterns. They were identical to those on the lantern, their intricate lines forming shapes that seemed almost alive. Among the carvings was a circular indentation the exact size of the lantern's base. "It fits," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The lantern belongs here." With a mixture of reverence and trepidation, Lillian placed the lantern into the indentation. As soon as it settled, a low hum filled the air, and the carvings began to glow faintly, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. The group stepped back, their eyes wide with wonder and unease. The hum grew louder, and then, as suddenly as it began, it ceased. The lantern emitted a soft, steady glow, its light casting an otherworldly sheen on the cliffs. Beneath their feet, the ground vibrated slightly, as though the earth itself was responding to the lantern's activation. Back at the inn, the group gathered once more, their excitement tempered by unanswered questions. Lillian couldn't shake the feeling that they had awakened something. But what? And why? She turned to the book again, her eyes scanning the pages for any clue. Toward the back, she found a passage she hadn't noticed before, written in H.R.'s familiar hand, but with a tone that felt more urgent. "To the one who keeps this light, you are its guardian, its protector. The lantern's purpose is not to illuminate paths, but to shield against shadows. When the time comes, you will understand. Until then, trust in the light. The words sent a chill through Lillian. The shadows HR spoke of seemed metaphorical, yet the gravity of his warning suggested something more. The villagers, too, sensed the weight of his words, their expressions somber as they considered what the lantern's light might be protecting them from. That night, Lillian stood alone by the window, watching the lantern's glow from its place on the cliffs. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. She couldn't shake the feeling that the lantern's activation had set something in motion, something she couldn't yet comprehend. As she turned away from the window, her gaze fell on the painting she had hung in the main room. The image of the lantern, held high against a stormy sky, seemed almost prophetic now. HR's words echoed in her mind. Trust in the light. Lillian knew she had no choice but to do just that. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same resolve that had carried her this far. The lantern's light would guide her and protect her, just as it always had. The storm rolled in with a ferocity Lillian hadn't seen in years, the wind howling through the village like a restless spirit. Rain lashed against the windows of the amber lantern, and the sea roared as waves crashed against the cliffs. Inside the inn, the golden light of the lantern by the door stood as a beacon against the darkness, its glow steady and unwavering. Lillian paced the main room, the cryptic warnings from HR's journal running through her mind. She had read and reread the passage. To the one who keeps this light, you are its guardian, its protector. The lantern's purpose is not to illuminate paths, but to shield against shadows. What shadows? What threat could possibly warrant such secrecy and care? As the storm intensified, Lillian found herself drawn to the window, her gaze fixed on the distant glow of the second lantern atop the cliffs. It pulsed faintly, almost alive, as though it were breathing in time with the storm. By midnight, the inn grew restless. Thomas, Mary, and Jacob had gathered at Lillian's request, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. The storm had rattled the village, and the sudden energy surrounding the lantern had not gone unnoticed. Even the villagers who hadn't been involved in the discovery spoke in hushed tones of a strange tension in the air, as if the storm carried with it more than just wind and rain. "Do you feel it?" Mary asked, her voice low. "It's like something is watching." Thomas nodded gravely. HR spoke of shadows. Perhaps he wasn't speaking metaphorically. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Before anyone could respond, a deafening crack of thunder shook the inn, followed by an eerie stillness. The storm seemed to pause, the air thick with anticipation. Then a faint, unnatural glow appeared on the horizon, far beyond the cliffs where the second lantern burned. "What is that?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lillian's heart raced as she grabbed the leather-bound book from the table. She flipped through its pages, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. Finally, she found a passage she had overlooked. "When the shadows rise, the lantern must burn bright. Its light will hold them at bay, but only if the keeper stands firm. Trust in the light, and it will protect you." Lillian set the book down, her resolve hardening. "We need to go to the cliffs," she said. "Whatever is happening, the lantern is key. HR believed in its power, and so must we." The group braved the storm, their lanterns cutting through the rain-soaked night. The path to the cliffs was treacherous, but Lillian led the way, her determination unshaken. When they reached the second lantern, its glow was brighter than before, illuminating the carvings on the rock with an ethereal light. The unnatural glow on the horizon had grown stronger, its edges flickering like flames. As the group stood before the lantern, the ground beneath them rumbled, and a low, guttural sound echoed across the cliffs. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, a deep vibration that seemed to resonate in their very bones. "What do we do?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling. Lillian stepped forward, her hand resting on the lantern. "We trust the light," she said firmly, just as HR did. With a deep breath, she adjusted the lantern's flame, increasing its intensity. The carvings around it began to glow brighter, their light spreading outward like veins of molten gold. The pulsing hum returned, this time accompanied by a faint, melodic sound that seemed to emanate from the lantern itself. The glow on the horizon began to waver, its edges shrinking as the light from the lantern grew stronger. The guttural sound faded, replaced by a rising wind that carried a sense of relief rather than fear. The storm began to ease, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle. As the group watched in awe, the second lantern emitted one final, brilliant flash of light. The unnatural glow on the horizon disappeared entirely, leaving only the faint outline of the cliffs against the night sky. The carvings dimmed, their golden light fading, and the lantern returned to its steady, gentle glow. Back at the inn, the group gathered around the hearth, their exhaustion tempered by a sense of quiet triumph. Lillian placed the leather-bound book on the table, her fingers tracing its worn cover. HR trusted the light, she said softly, and tonight it proved him right. Whatever those shadows were, the lantern held them back. It protected us, just as it always has. Thomas nodded, his expression thoughtful. The lantern isn't just a symbol, it's a promise that even in the darkest times there is light to be found. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Lillian felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had come to the amber lantern searching for solace, and she had found it, not just in the inn itself, but in the people, the stories, and the light that connected them all. That night, as the village slept, the lantern on the cliffs burned brightly, its golden glow a steadfast reminder that even the deepest shadows could not extinguish its light. And in her room, Lillian dreamed of a future where the amber lantern would continue to shine, guiding and protecting all who sought its warmth. Thank you for joining us on Story Planet. If you felt the warmth of the amber lantern and found yourself wrapped in its light, consider giving a thumbs up. If this story brought you peace and calm, feel free to share it with friends and family. And don't forget to subscribe to be part of our nightly journeys where serene tales await you every day. Wishing you a peaceful night and sweet dreams. Good night from Story Planet.